The morning they sold me, Victor Harlan read my weight out loud in front of the whole town. 194 pounds. He said it like an apology, like he was doing the man on the other end of the transaction a favor by warning him first. I was standing 6 feet away when he said it, close enough to see the little smile that came after the kind of smile a man wears when he knows everyone in the room is grateful they are not the one being talked about. I did not look away from him. I had learned a long time ago that looking away was the thing that made them feel like they had won something. My name is Nora Price. I was 25 years old on the morning Victor Harlan sold me to settle my father's debt. I weighed 194 pounds. I had brown hair that I kept pinned up because loose hair got in the way of work. I had hands that were stronger than they looked, which most people never noticed because most people did not look at my hands. And I had spent the better part of my life in a town called Crestwood, Montana Territory, learning to be invisible in a place where everyone saw everything and talked about most of it by sundown. Crestwood sat at the foot of the Bitterroot Range, 380 people pressed together on one main road with 2 saloons, a church that held services on Sundays and gossip on every other day of the week, and a general store that smelled like sawdust and old credit. It was a logging town, which meant it ran on the labor of men who came down from the mountains every few weeks with money in their pockets and nowhere particular to spend it. It was also the kind of town where a girl like me learned early that the shape of her body was considered public property, something anyone could comment on, measure, dismiss, or laugh about, and the girl herself had very little say in the matter. They called me Beryl. Not always to my face, though, sometimes to my face, because cruelty does not always bother to be subtle in a small town. More often it was whispered at a volume that was designed to carry loud enough to land quiet enough to deny. I heard it from the men sitting outside the Garrison Saloon when I walked past with my arms full of supplies. I heard it from the women who came into Mercer's pharmacy for their headache powders and spoke to each other while I stood 3 feet away, measuring out their prescriptions as if I were furniture, as if being large meant you had also gone deaf. And then there was the other kind, the worst kind in some ways, the kind that looked at me with something that was almost like pity and said "Poor Nora" in soft voices and brought me a piece of pie at church socials and meant every bit of it as kindness. I understood they meant well. I also understood that being pitied and being respected are 2 entirely different things, and I had never been confused about which one I was receiving. My mother had been a large woman too. She had my same build, my same way of taking up space without apology, and she had loved me the way a person loves something that belongs to them completely and without condition. She died of consumption when I was 15. The disease moved through her slowly, and then all at once the way it moves through everyone it takes, and I watched it happen over the course of 2 years with very little I could do to stop it. After she died, the house got quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. My father, Clem Price, was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the story and because the truth of people is rarely as simple as bad or good. He was a weak man in a hard situation, and weakness in a hard situation produces a particular kind of damage that takes years to fully understand. He had worked the mines until the mine took something from him that could not be given back. The collapse of 1885 left him with 2 cracked ribs that healed wrong, a shoulder that never worked quite right again, and a debt to Victor Harlan that started as medical bills and grew the way debts grow when the person who holds them is patient and strategic and not particularly interested in being repaid in money when there are other forms of repayment available. I worked at Mercer's pharmacy on the main road of Crestwood. Dolph Mercer was a decent enough man in the way that some men are decent, which is to say he would not go out of his way to hurt you, but he also would not go out of his way to protect you if protecting you cost him anything. I compounded prescriptions, organized the stock read labels aloud for customers who could not read them themselves, and kept records in a handwriting that was neater than Dr. Silas Phelps's handwriting, which was not saying much, but was a fact nonetheless. Dr. Phelps was the only physician in Crestwood. He was 55 years old and had not opened a medical text since roughly 1871, a gap in his education that he covered with confidence and bourbon in approximately equal measure. Nobody paid me what I was worth. Nobody asked what I wanted. This was not unusual for a woman in Crestwood in 1887. It was simply the water I swam in, and you do not spend much time thinking about water when you have always been underwater. There was one thing I did that nobody knew about. One private act that I carried out alone week after week that was mine and nobody else's. Her name was Maggie Cole. She was 16 years old, the daughter of a logging man named Tom Cole, who lived 3 miles outside of town. Maggie came into Mercer's pharmacy every week to pick up cough syrup for her father, or so she said. But I had been watching Maggie Cole for 8 months, and I was fairly certain by the 3rd month that the cough syrup was not for her father. It was for her. She was thin the way people get thin when something is taken from them from the inside. Her skin had gone from pale to the particular yellowish white that I recognized because I had watched it happen once before in someone I loved. She wore extra layers even in the warm months. She moved carefully the way people move when breathing has become something that requires effort rather than something that simply happens. Dr. Phelps had seen her twice. Both times he had said she was thin-blooded and given her a tonic and sent her home. I had filled those prescriptions and watched her leave and said nothing because I was the pharmacy girl and nobody asked the pharmacy girl for her medical opinions. But I kept records. Every week when Maggie came in, I noted the date and what I observed in a small notebook that I kept under the counter and then took home with me at night. The color of her lips,
It feels better
whether she was coughing more or less than the week before, whether there was anything visible on her handkerchief when she pressed it to her mouth.
Make sure those crates are delivered.
I wrote 2 letters to a physician in Billings whose name I had found in a medical directory describing what I was seeing and asking whether my suspicions were correct. The letters came back unopened. The address had changed and I had no way to find the new one. What I was seeing was consumption. I was almost certain of it. And there was nothing I could do about it because I was Nora Price, the pharmacy girl, the barrel, the poor thing, and nobody in Crestwood was going to hear a medical opinion from me. The morning everything changed began like the mornings before it. I woke before 6. I dressed in my work clothes, the dark skirt and plain blouse that I wore most days because they were practical, and I had learned to value practical things. I made coffee on the small stove in the kitchen of the house I shared with my father, and I brought a cup to him the way I had done most mornings. And when I pushed open the door to his room, I found him already awake and dressed. He was wearing the brown wool suit. He only wore it for serious occasions, church and funerals mostly, and since it was a Tuesday, and nobody that I knew of had recently died, the suit told me something before he opened his mouth. On the kitchen table was a bottle of bourbon. Not the cheap kind he usually kept. Better than that, the kind you opened when you were trying to fortify yourself for something specific. Beside it was an envelope already opened, the paper folded back out and lying flat. He did not look at me when I came in. He was looking at the bourbon. "Victor Heartland came by yesterday," he said. "I know what that means." I said because I did. "The debt's called in, all of it." "How much?"
Please, I didn't
He told
do
me
it.
the number. I sat down.
You have to believe
The number
me.
was not possible. It was not a number arrived at through ordinary lending and ordinary interest. It was a number that had grown because someone wanted it to grow when the person holding the debt is more interested in leverage than in repayment, when the original terms had been written in a way that allowed for interpretation, and the interpretation had been made by the person with the most to gain from it. Victor Heartland was the closest thing Crestwood had to a feudal lord, though he would not have used that word, and neither would most people in town because calling something what it is requires a kind of clarity that is uncomfortable to sit with. He controlled the logging contracts that kept most of the men in Crestwood employed. He held mortgages on half the buildings on the main road. He had extended credit to families during the hard winters of 1883 and 1884 when there was nothing else available, and the interest on that credit had been compounding quietly ever since, and now in the fall of 1887, he was beginning to collect. 2 years earlier, when the mine collapsed and my father was in the hospital with cracked ribs and a shoulder that would never sit right again, Heartland had come to the hospital room. He had brought flowers, which was either kindness or theater, and he had set them on the windowsill and put a piece of paper on the blanket over my father's legs and placed a pen beside it. "Sign here and your girl's safe," he had said. My father had asked what he was signing. Heartland had said formalities, just formalities, and my father had believed him because he was in pain and scared, and the alternative to signing was something he could not see clearly from where he was lying. He signed. He had never read the full document. I did not know this until much later. "There's a man up on Widow's Peak," my father said, now still not looking at me. "Name's Callum Greer. Heartland brokered it. Greer paid the debt, all of it." The name was familiar the way a story is familiar, something you have heard told around you without ever being told directly to you. Callum Greer, the man on the mountain. He had been up there for 8 years alone doing something that people described differently depending on who was describing it. Some said he
carried
was a
this thought
healer.
since February,
Some said he was
weighing me
strange.
down.
Some said he had gone up there
But
after his
seeing you
father
now,
died
I know
and
I
had
have
simply
to say
never
it.
come back down,
I know
which
it's
they said
complicated, but I
as though
want
it
to
were a
stay.
character flaw, as though choosing
Stay
the
then.
mountain over the town
We'll figure the
indicated
rest
some
out.
failure of judgment. "What does he want with me?" I asked. My father's hand tightened around the glass. "A wife, someone to help with his work." "When?" "Today, noon. Harlan's calling it a wedding." I sat for a moment with that. The kitchen was quiet
Excuse me,
except
we
for
are
the
ready
sound of
for
the
you
stove
now.
ticking as the metal cooled. Through the window I could see the main road of Crestwood beginning to wake up, a wagon passing a man in a coat walking fast toward the mill. I thought about what I had in this house. I thought about the letters to Billings that had come back unopened. I thought about Maggie Cole and the notebook under the pharmacy counter. I thought about 25 years of being the Beryl, the poor thing, the girl who took up too much space and not enough of the right kind. I got up from the table. I went upstairs. I packed a bag, which did not take long because I did not have much 3 changes of clothes, a bar of soap, the small notebook with Maggie's records in it, and the most recent unsent letter to the Billings doctor, which I had been carrying around for 2 weeks not knowing how to send it. I came back downstairs. My father was still at the table. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first time he had looked at me. "I know," I said. I did not say anything else. Not because I had nothing to say, but because some things are too large for the words available in that moment, and I had learned over the years that speaking too soon often meant saying the wrong thing, and I did not want my last words in that house to be the wrong ones. The town hall of Crestwood was a single-story building with plank walls and 2 narrow windows that let in almost no light. It smelled like pine resin and old paper. By the time I arrived at 1:45, most of the town had already gathered, and I want to be clear that they had not been invited. In a town of 380 people, you do not need an invitation to a spectacle. You simply go. I walked in through the front door, and I did not stop walking. This was a decision I had made in the street outside, 1 foot in front of the other, head level, eyes forward. I had learned this when I was 12 years old, and I had been refining it ever since. The trick is not to become hard. Hard means you stop feeling it, and feeling it is important. It keeps you honest. The trick is to walk through it while feeling all of it, which is a different and more difficult skill. From somewhere in the crowd to my left, low enough to carry the distance between us, a man's voice said what it said. I will not repeat it here because repeating it gives it more space than it deserves. I walked through it the same way I had walked through 25 years of it. 1 foot, then the other. Victor Harlan stood at the front of the room in a coat that cost more than most men in Crestwood made in a month. He was a large man, not in the way I was large, but in the way that money expands a man, the habit of taking up whatever space he wants because no one has told him not to, because no one has ever told them not to. His hair was combed. His smile was the smile of a man who has already decided how something will end. And then there was the man standing apart from everyone else near the far wall, in the particular way of a person who does not attend to crowds as a general principle. Callum Greer. I had formed a picture in my mind on the walk over. The picture had been assembled from scraps of second-hand information and a certain amount of reasonable assumption, and it was wrong in almost every particular. I had expected old. I had expected something soft or damaged or desperate, some quality that would explain why a man would arrange a marriage through a broker rather than by the ordinary means. What I found instead was a man of perhaps 38 or 39 years tall, in the way of someone who carries weight outside for a living rather than someone who was born to it, with dark brown hair that had not been cut recently and a jaw that carried several days of growth that was not fashionable but simply unattended to. He was wearing a wool shirt the color of pine bark and canvas trousers that had seen considerable work. There was no jewelry on him, no watch chain, nothing decorative. His hands were visible at his sides, and I noticed them the way I notice things about people, which was carefully and without always meaning to. Scar tissue across the knuckles of his right hand, and a longer, thinner line of white scar running from the base of his left thumb down toward the wrist. Not fighting scars. Working scars. The kind that come from tools used repeatedly over many years in conditions that did not always allow for caution. He was looking at me when I looked up, not assessing, not measuring, not the way the rest of the room was looking at me, which was the way you look at something you have already decided how to categorize. He was looking at me the way you look at weather when you are trying to determine what it will do. Careful, attentive, withholding judgment until more information was available. I held his gaze. I was good at that. Harlan spoke for several minutes about the nature of the arrangement, using words like settlement and partnership and the fulfillment of obligations, which was a way of describing a transaction that dressed it up as something more dignified than it was. My father's name was mentioned. The debt was mentioned. Callum Greer's name was mentioned in connection with its payment, which was confirmation of what I already understood. My father stood beside me through this and did not look at me, which was the kindest thing he could do. Callum said I do when asked in a voice that was quiet but clear, the voice of someone accustomed to making themselves understood without raising it. The formalities concluded. Harlan announced the thing was done with a satisfaction that he did not bother to conceal. The room gave a response that was somewhere between applause and the sound people make when they do not know what else to do with their hands. It was the saddest noise I had ever heard in a room. Callum Greer's wagon was parked at the north end of the main road. It was a working wagon, solid and plain, loaded in the back with supplies covered by canvas. The horse was a bay mare, older, steady-looking. There was nothing about the wagon that announced itself, which was consistent with everything else I had observed about its owner. He offered me his hand to climb up. I took it because the wagon step was high and I was carrying my bag, and it was the practical thing to do. His grip was firm and he released it immediately when I was seated. He took the reins without ceremony, and we left Crestwood. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that I needed to see again right then. We rode for perhaps an hour. The road out of Crestwood followed the valley floor for the first few miles, and then began to rise gradually at first, and then more steeply into the foothills of the Bitterroot Range. The trees pressed closer on both sides, ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, and the smell changed from the sawdust and livestock smell of the town to something colder and cleaner. The light changed, too broken by the canopy, into shifting pieces. Callum Greer did not speak for that entire hour. Neither did I, because I was thinking, and because I did not know yet what the right first words between us were. There were many wrong ones available, and I was not in the habit of rushing toward them. He stopped the wagon on a straight section of road where the trees opened briefly on the right side, and you could see back down the valley. Crestwood was visible as a smudge of rooftops and chimney smoke at the base of the mountains. He did not stop for the view. He stopped the way a man stops when he has decided to do something and is committed to doing it before the moment passes. He did not look at me right away. He looked at the road ahead. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it. You can get off this wagon right now." He said it the way he might state a fact about the weather, not unkindly but without softening it. "I'll give you enough money to reach Billings. You'll never hear from me again. That's a real offer." I looked at him. The line of his jaw, the way he held the reins loose in his hands, not gripping. "Why would you do that?" "Because I paid a debt. That doesn't make you mine." I let that settle for a moment. Then I said, "What do you actually need up there?" He was quiet for a few seconds, and I had the sense that he was deciding not how to frame the answer, but whether to give it honestly or give it carefully, and that he was choosing honestly. Someone who can read pharmaceutical labels without errors. Someone who won't lose their head when things go wrong in the night. Someone strong enough to assist in surgery when I need a second pair of hands and I can't wait for morning. He paused. "Dolph Mercer told Harlan you caught 2 dispensing errors last year that could have killed people. That you can identify compounds by smell. That you read medical texts during your lunch break when business was slow." This was true. All of it was true. I had not known that Mercer had said it to anyone, or that anyone had been listening. "Harlan told me you were desperate," Callum continued. "I don't need desperate." "He was describing my father," I said. "Not me." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Not a smile exactly, but an acknowledgement. "I know that now." I looked back toward where Crestwood had disappeared behind the trees. 25 years. The pharmacy counter, the notebook under it. The letters that came back unopened. Poor Nora with her pie at church socials and barrel from the men outside the garrison. Maggie Cole and the things I had seen and recorded and not been able to do anything about because I was not the kind of person this town listened to. I looked at the road ahead. It went up and further up into the mountains. "Drive?" I said. He looked at me for one moment, the same careful looking as before. Then he nodded once very slightly and turned back to the road and clicked his tongue at the horse, and we moved forward, and the trees closed in behind us, and Crestwood was gone. The road to Widow's Peak took 3 more hours after the moment on the flat stretch where he stopped the wagon. The first hour was gradual climbing through second-growth timber. The second hour was steeper, the road narrowing to something that was less a road than a track, 2 ruts in the earth pressed down by repeated use rather than anything deliberately built. By the third hour, the elevation had changed the character of everything around us. The trees were older here, bigger around with less undergrowth between them because the canopy was thick enough to keep the light out. The temperature had dropped. I could see my breath by the time we reached the top of the last switchback and the cabin came into view. I want to describe what I saw accurately because the accurate description is important. The cabin was not what I had been picturing, and what I had been picturing had been shaped by the stories people in Crestwood told about Callum Greer, which were mostly the stories people tell about someone they do not understand, and so have invented a version of. It was larger than a typical homesteader's cabin, not large by any standard that implied comfort or prosperity, but larger than it needed to be if its only purpose was shelter. The extra space made sense when you understood what the space was for. It sat against a rock face on the north side in a way that was clearly deliberate, the rock providing a windbreak, and I realized later a degree of temperature stability through the coldest months. There was a woodpile stacked along the east wall that was carefully covered with a sheet of canvas, and the stack was high enough to tell you someone had done the arithmetic on how much a hard winter required and had cut and stacked accordingly. Callum stopped the wagon and set the brake. He climbed down and offered his hand again for the step. I took it again because the step was still high. The air at this elevation smelled completely different from anything below. Pine and something mineral underneath rock and cold water, and above it all a cleanness that was almost startling after the compressed smells of a town. Inside, the door opened directly into the main room, which was also the workroom, which told you immediately what kind of place this was. The walls on 3 sides were lined with shelving floor to ceiling, every shelf occupied. Glass jars of various sizes and colors, each with a paper label written in a hand I did not yet know was not Callum's. Bundles of dried plant material hanging from wooden pegs above one of the shelves. Equipment, metal instruments in trays, rolled cloth kits with their contents visible through the gaps in the roll, a scale for measuring a glass, measuring apparatus with graduated markings that I recognized from the pharmacy. And in the center of the room, a table. Not a dining table. The height was wrong for eating too tall, designed for a person to work at while standing. The surface was hardwood, thick planks fitted together without gaps. It was clean. The wood had been scrubbed. But wood holds what has happened to it in a way that scrubbing cannot fully undo. And the grain of the table had darkened in a pattern that I recognized, not fresh old, the accumulation of many episodes of the same kind of work over many years. I had filled enough prescriptions for enough people who had come back from this cabin alive that I understood what the table was without needing it explained. "Your room is through that door," Callum said, pointing to a door on the left side of the room. "Outhouse is 30 yards north. Follow the path, you'll see it. Take a lantern after dark without fail. The east edge of the property drops off. It's a long way down." "How many patients come up here in a year?" I asked. "Depends on the season and what happens down below." He was unloading the supply bags he had purchased in town, setting them on the long shelf below the window without looking at me. "Summer, sometimes 3 or 4 a week. Winter, the roads close and it slows to almost nothing. The ones who do come in winter are the bad ones, the ones desperate enough to try regardless. And you've been managing all of it alone." He set down the bag he was holding. "Until now," he said, and turned and went back out to the wagon to get the rest of the supplies. That was the first conversation we had in the cabin. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment after he went back outside, just stood and looked. I looked at the labeled jars and tried to read the nearest ones from where I was standing. Yarrow, willow bark, something in Latin that I recognized from the pharmacy texts. I looked at the instruments in their trays, clean and arranged with a care that was not decorative but functional. Everything placed so that anyone who knew what they were looking for could find it in the dark. On the highest shelf, pushed back almost to the wall, a row of glass jars, different from the rest. These were sealed differently, not with the cork stoppers the others used, but with something waxed over the top. And the labels on them were in the rounder, unsteady hand, that was different from all the other labeling in the room.
Make sure those
Somebody
crates are
else's
delivered to the
handwriting.
hotel by noon.
Older,
Yes, sir,
more
right
tired.
away.
I looked at them for a moment. Then I went through the door to my room. The room was small. A narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, a wooden chest with a flat lid, practical storage, a window with shutters that opened outward onto the view to the south, which in daylight would show the valley far below, a wooden box serving as a nightstand with a candle in a tin holder on top of it. It was the first room I had ever had that was entirely my own. I set my bag on the bed and sat down beside it. The mattress was rope strung beneath a ticking pad, firm, the kind that would not hold the shape of one particular body because it had not yet been slept in enough to do that. My room. The words felt strange not because I was frightened of them, but because I was not sure yet what to do with them. Through the wall I could hear Callum moving in the main room, the sound of glass on wood, the creak of a shelf. Organizing, checking inventory. I guess the same way I checked inventory at Mercer's at the end of each day, making sure everything was where it should be before morning. I opened my bag and took out the small notebook, Maggie's records, 8 months of careful observation. I set it on the wooden box beside the candle. Then I took out the letter to the Billings doctor and set it beside the notebook. I looked at both of them in the low afternoon light coming through the open shutter. She was still down there, still coughing, still being given syrup that was not going to help her. I had no way to help her from up here either. Not yet, not until I understood what was available here and what was not. But for the first time in 8 months, I was somewhere with more tools than I had before. I did not know yet exactly what that meant. I intended to find out. I blew out the candle and lay down on the unfamiliar mattress and listened to the mountain quiet, which was not actually quiet at all, but full of sounds that were simply different from town sounds. Wind in the canopy, something distant that might have been water, the cabin settling in the cold, and Callum Greer's footsteps crossing the main room once more before they stopped and the cabin went still. I did not sleep for a long time, but I lay still, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. They came at 3 in the morning. The knocking was not the polite knock of someone who expects to wait. It was the knock of a person with both fists, or possibly with an open palm knocking, that announced something already wrong and getting worse. I was off the bed and through the door before I had fully assembled the thought to do it.
I feel 10 pounds
The main
lighter.
room flooded with cold air as Callum pulled the door open. 2 men stood in the frame, and between them they held a third, who was not standing on his own. The third man was making a sound that I do not have a precise word for, not quite screaming, something that sits below screaming in the register of pain, more fundamental and less controlled. He was a large man, a logging man by the build, and the calluses visible on his free hand and his left leg from the knee down was wrong in a way that I registered and then moved past registering because there was no time to keep registering it. "Tree came down wrong," one of the 2 men said. His voice was shaking. "Hit the leg on the way. We carried him 3 miles. Callum was already at the shelf. He did not look back. "Cabinet right of the window. The tall brown bottle with the cork stopper label says laudanum. Measure 2 fingers into a cup. Move." I moved. The shelf had 12 brown bottles of varying sizes. I read the labels without stopping one after another until I had the right one. Poured 2 fingers into a tin cup. Brought it to the table where the 2 men had laid the third one down the leg, visible now in the full light of the lamp Callum had lit, and I looked at it once clearly and completely, because looking away was not a useful response. The man was conscious, which was the worst and the best thing simultaneously. Conscious meant he could drink. It also meant he could feel everything. "Drink this," I said. I held the cup to his mouth. He tried to turn his head away, and I put my other hand against his jaw firmly but not roughly, and I said it again. "You drink this or he works on your leg while you're fully awake. I've looked at that shelf. I know what the tools are.
We are ready for
Make a
you
choice." He drank. What followed was 4 hours that I will describe accurately, which means I will not make it cleaner than it was, or more dramatic than it already was, because the truth of it is dramatic enough, and cleaner accounts do a disservice to what medical work of this kind actually involves. Callum worked. He moved with an economy of motion that told me this was not new to him, not this kind of injury or this kind of night or this kind of pressure. He spoke when he needed something, named what he needed, did not repeat himself. I had been inside a pharmacy for 6 years. I knew the names of the instruments he named because I had read the texts during the slow afternoons when Mercer was out and there was nothing else to do. I found what he asked for. I held what he told me to hold. When he said, "Do not let him move," I used my weight, and I did not let the man move. There was a point somewhere in the second hour when I understood that I had stopped being afraid of the smell and the sight of what was on the table. Not because I had become indifferent to it, but because the work was specific enough that there was no space left in my attention for anything other than the work. Callum needed the next thing, and I provided the next thing, and then he needed the one after that. The fear was still present in some layer underneath. I could feel it there, but it was not in charge. By the time the light from the window had shifted from black to the deep blue that comes just before dawn, the man on the table was unconscious from the laudanum and exhaustion and the physical shock of what had happened to his body. But his breathing was regular, and his color, though poor, was not the color of someone who is about to stop. Callum stepped back from the table. He went to the basin and began washing his hands in water that turned dark immediately. His shoulders had a different quality than they had had 4 hours earlier, something released from them that had been held throughout the night. "You didn't freeze," he said. He did not turn around. "I almost did," I said. "In the first few minutes. The smell. Most people stop at almost." He set the cloth down and turned around. He looked at me in the growing light the same way he had looked at me in the town hall, that careful measuring regard, but something in it had shifted. There was something different there now that I could not quite name yet. "Get some sleep," he said. 2 hours if you can. Then I'll show you the system, how everything is organized, where everything is." I nodded. My legs, when I moved toward my room, had a quality of separation from the rest of me that I recognized as exhaustion. I sat down on the floor of the main room, just sat my back against the cabinet below the shelves. It was not a decision exactly. My body made it before I could overrule it. I looked at the ceiling of the cabin as the light continued to change gray, becoming something warmer. I could hear Callum moving quietly, putting instruments in order, making the room usable again for whenever the next night required it. I had survived the first night. I was still here. On the highest shelf, visible from where I was sitting on the floor, the row of wax-sealed jars with the different handwriting on their labels. Somebody else's work, somebody else's years. Sitting here on this floor in this light, I could not yet know what any of it meant. But the light kept coming in, and Callum Greer was organizing his instruments in the next room, and I was still here. For now, that was a complete sentence. 3 months passed, the way hard work passes quickly in retrospect, and not quickly at all while it is happening. September became October. October became November. The aspens below the timberline went gold, and then went bare. And then the first snow came. Not the serious snow, just the warning snow, a light covering that melted by mid-morning, but left a coldness in the air that did not entirely leave again. Patients came from places I had not known existed before I came up the mountain. Logging camps 10 miles north, homestead claims in the river valleys that did not appear on any map I had seen, a silver mining operation 2 ridges east that Callum said was worked by men who had come from 3 different countries and shared no common language except the one that is communicated by injury. They came on horseback and on foot, and occasionally in wagons that had no business on the track that served as our road, and they came at all hours because pain and accident observed no schedule. Callum treated everyone. He did not ask about ability to pay before he asked about the injury. He accepted what people offered afterward, which was sometimes money and sometimes not money. Smoked elk meat. A hand-stitched quilt that appeared one morning on the porch with no note attached. 6 months of credit at a trading post. 2 days north, offered by a trapper whose infected hand Callum had saved in October. The infection already advanced enough when he arrived that another day would have made the outcome different. Callum noted everything received in a ledger with the same precision he applied to medical records. He was not indifferent to the practical realities of running a supply-dependent operation in a remote location. He simply did not let those realities determine who he helped. I learned by immersion, which is the only way certain things can be learned. Callum did not lecture. He did not set aside time for instruction. He worked, and I worked beside him. And when I did something wrong, he told me what was wrong and showed me the correct method and expected me not to repeat the error. This system had no patience built into it and no reassurance, but it also had no condescension, which I found I valued more than either of the other things. I learned to identify infection by the smell of it before I could see the visible signs, because sometimes the visible signs arrived after the moment for intervention had already passed. I learned the difference between a clean break and a spiral fracture by feel with my hands, the way Callum had learned it from his father, and his father had learned it from a professor in St. Louis who had learned it from a man who had learned it in the field during the war. I learned to compound 3 different formulations from dried plant material when the pharmaceutical supplies ran low, which they did twice in October and once in early November. I learned that the correct way to hold a patient still during a painful procedure is not with force applied uniformly, but with force applied at specific points that minimize the involuntary movement without restricting breathing. I made mistakes. I made them clearly and specifically, and I did not make the same mistake twice, which was the only standard Callum seemed to hold himself to, and which therefore became the standard I held myself to. One evening in early October, Callum came back from checking the trapline he maintained to the north of the cabin, a task he did every few days because the trapline provided both supplemental food and information about what large animals were moving through the area. I was in the main room working through a stack of his older patient records, which I had asked permission to read and which he had granted without asking why. I was building a mental index of what he had encountered and how he had responded to it, because the index would make me faster when I needed to be fast. He came in and stood for a moment inside the door, reading the room with the automatic attention of a man who had learned that rooms change when you are not watching them, checking without appearing to check that everything was where it should be and that nothing required immediate attention. Then he crossed to the basin and washed his hands and said without turning around, "There's a family coming tomorrow. Cole. Father's bringing his daughter. She's been sick." I set the records down. "Maggie Cole." He turned around. "You know her from Crestwood, from the pharmacy." I paused. "I've been tracking her symptoms for 8 months. She comes in every week. I've been recording what I see." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think it is?" I told him what I thought it was. He listened without interrupting, giving the speaker the full space of what they were trying to say before he formed a response to it. "The records you've been keeping," he said. "Can I see them?" I went to my room and came back with the notebook. He sat down at the table and read through it from the beginning. He read the way he did everything completely and without rushing. When he finished, he looked up. 8 months, he said. "Yes. You were doing this alone, in Crestwood. There wasn't anyone else to do it." He held the notebook for a moment longer before setting it on the table between us. He did not give it back immediately, which I understood. He was not taking it from me. He was acknowledging it as something that belonged in the space between us, rather than only in my pocket. "Phelps saw her twice," he asked. "Gave her a tonic both times. Said she was thin-blooded." Something crossed his expression that was not quite anger and not quite resignation, but had elements of both. He did not comment on Phelps directly. "When they come tomorrow," he said, "tell me what you observe while I examine her. I want your read alongside mine." This was the first time he had asked for my assessment rather than my assistance. I understood the difference. I did not make a remark about it. I simply said yes and went back to the patient records I had been reading, and we spent the rest of the evening in our usual companionable silence, which was not empty silence, but the silence of 2 people doing separate work in the same space and finding that arrangement functional and gradually something more than merely functional. The Cole family arrived the following afternoon. Tom Cole was a large man, logging built, with the particular exhaustion in his face of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has been managing the fear by working harder, as though effort is a form of control over outcomes that are not actually controllable. He carried his daughter into the cabin because she could not walk the distance from the wagon on her own, and this, more than anything else, told me how far she had declined since I last saw her in September. Maggie was lighter than she should have been. I could see it in how her father carried her, the way you can sometimes see weight by how an absence of it changes the way a body is held. Her color was wrong in the way I had been watching it become wrong for 8 months, that particular yellowing beneath the pale. Her breathing was audible from across the room. Callum examined her with his hands and his stethoscope and asked her questions in the quiet, direct way he asked patients questions, not performing gentleness, but actually being gentle, which is a different thing, and children can always tell the difference. I stood near the window and watched and noted what I observed the way I had been noting things for 8 months. Except now there was someone in the room who would actually do something with what I observed. Afterward, he walked the family outside and spoke with Tom Cole for several minutes. I stayed inside with Maggie, who was lying on the padded surface Callum used for patient examination when the main table was not required, and I sat in the chair beside her, and we talked about small things. The kind of small things you talk about with a 16-year-old girl when the large things are too heavy to carry in polite conversation. She asked me if I liked it up here. I told her I was still deciding which was true at the time. When the family left, Callum came back inside and closed the door and stood with his back to it for a moment. "Consumption," he said. "Yes," I said. "Advanced. She's been sick longer than they know." "I know. I wrote to a doctor in Billings twice. The letters came back. Address had changed." He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something about the letters, or about Phelps, or about the 8 months of careful, unacknowledged work in the notebook on the table. Instead, he said, "There's nothing we can do for the disease. Not in 1887, not anywhere. There's no treatment that changes the course of it. I know that too. What we can do is manage the pain, make the time she has left less difficult than it would otherwise be." He paused. "And her brother, the boy, Jesse, he's 12. The father mentioned he's been coughing for 3 weeks. Bring him up when you can," he said. Callum moved to the shelf and began checking the supply level of one of the jars without turning to face me. "If it's what I think it might be, it's not what Maggie has. It's treatable. The outcome can be different." I sat with that for a moment. The difference between the two outcomes. One child and then another child in the same family, and the medicine available to help one of them and not the other. The arithmetic of that was not something I could do anything about. What I could do was be here in this cabin when Jesse Cole was brought up the mountain. That night I lay in my room and thought about the sealed jars on the highest shelf. I had been thinking about them since the first morning, peripherally, the way you think about something you are not yet ready to examine directly. The different handwriting, the wax seals, the dates rather than compound names. I knew from the records I had been reading that Callum had been on Widow's Peak for 8 years. The records went back that far and no further in his hand, but some of the equipment in the cabin was older than 8 years. Some of the wear on certain things spoke to longer use than 8 years could account for.
Thomas.
Someone had been here before him, someone who had cared enough about whatever was in those sealed jars to protect it carefully against the mountain air and the mountain damp. I thought about the handwriting, rounder than Callum's, more deliberate in the way that a person's handwriting becomes when their hand no longer moves as fluidly as it once did. His father had been a doctor, trained in St. Louis, had lost a practice in Helena and come up here, had died of pneumonia at 62. I was not ready to open the question yet, but I was close to ready. 2 days later, I was alone in the main room during the middle of the afternoon, conducting the weekly inventory that I had taken over from Callum in October, because my system was faster and less prone to the small errors that accumulate when a person is too familiar with something to look at it carefully anymore. I worked from the bottom shelves up, counting and recording, checking condition of seals and labels, flagging anything that needed restocking. I reached the highest shelf. I counted each jar in sequence. When I reached the sealed ones, the ones with the different handwriting, I counted those too. There were 11 of them. The labels were dated across a span of years, the earliest from 1871, the most recent from 1878, 9 years ago. The 11th jar was positioned at the end of the row. Its label had a date 1878, and below the date a notation that was longer than the others. I had to stand on the step stool to read it clearly. The notation was a formula reference, a shorthand that I recognized from pharmaceutical training as the kind of notation a trained physician would use to indicate a compound in development, not a finished compound, but a direction, a trajectory. This is where the work was going when the work stopped. I lifted the jar. It was heavier than the others. Inside, through the glass, I could see not a substance but a book, a small one bound in dark cloth wrapped in a layer of waxed linen. I stood on the step stool in the afternoon light and held the jar for a moment. Then I climbed down and sat at the table and opened the jar and unwrapped the waxed linen and opened the book. The handwriting inside was the same as the labels, rounder than Callum's, deliberate, grown unsteady in the later pages. A physician's notebook, but not a patient record. The entries were dated, but what they recorded was not cases. They recorded a process, a years-long effort to develop something. Edgar Greer, M.D. Callum's father. I read slowly. The early entries were dense with technical notation that I worked through carefully using what I knew from pharmacy training and what I had been learning in the 3 months on Widow's Peak. A pain management compound, something intended to work differently from laudanum to achieve the same result through a different mechanism, one that Edgar Greer believed would not produce the same physical dependency that laudanum produced in patients who required it over extended periods. He had been working on it for years, testing formulations, adjusting ratios. The middle entries showed the progression of the work, each iteration building on the last. Each failure noted clearly and analytically, no self-pity in the record, just the next adjustment and the next trial. And then threaded through the middle entries like something woven in carefully so as not to be noticed at first the name, Heartland. Victor Heartland had funded Edgar Greer's research. The entries mentioned him first as a benefactor, a man who had come to Edgar and Helena after Edgar's practice there had lost its wealthy clients. Heartland had offered money and materials and the use of a proper laboratory space in exchange for the entries, said carefully a share of what the work produced. The entries became more guarded as they went on. The word share appeared more often, and then the word control appeared, and then there were entries that were clearly written with some agitation, the handwriting more pressured, the letters less perfectly formed. Heartland wants ownership, not a share. Everything. He says his investment entitles him to it. I disagreed. He did not accept my disagreement. Further on, he came again. Brought a lawyer this time. They had papers. I did not sign. The lawyer said I was being unreasonable. I said medicine belongs to no one man. They left. I do not think they are done. And near the end, the handwriting deteriorating in the way of someone who is ill and knows it. I don't have much time. The last 30 pages of this record contain the complete formula as close to complete as I can make it in the time I have. Some of it I cannot write clearly anymore. Callum will have to finish it. He has the knowledge. He'll need help with the pages that are damaged. Someone who can read what I cannot write clearly anymore. Keep this safe. Heartland will come looking when I'm gone. He always does. He believes ownership is a matter of persistence. Don't let him have it. Not for money, not for anything. The formula belongs to medicine, not to any one man. I set the notebook down on the table. I sat very still for a long moment. Victor Heartland, the man who had read my weight aloud in the Crestwood Town Hall 3 months ago. The man who had sold me to settle my father's debt. The man who, had I now understood, arranged that transaction with a specific knowledge of what was on Widow's Peak and a specific interest in what had been in Callum Greer's cabin for 9 years. He had not sent me here because I was convenient. He had sent me here because I was the only person in Crestwood who had the pharmaceutical training to identify what Edgar Greer's notebook contained. He had been patient for 9 years watching from below, and when the opportunity to place someone useful inside the cabin presented itself, he had taken it. I was the instrument. That was what I had been from the beginning. I looked at the notebook on the table. Then I looked at the last page. I had read the handwriting that had stopped being fully legible. The last 30 pages Edgar had written. The complete formula. But the pages were damaged, the ink faded in places, water-stained in others, the notation partially obscured in ways that someone without pharmaceutical training might not be able to reconstruct. Someone who can read what I cannot write clearly anymore. I wrapped the book back in its waxed linen, put it back in the jar, sealed it as closely as I could to how it had been sealed before, climbed back up the step stool and returned it to its position at the end of the row. Then I climbed down and finished the inventory and recorded everything in the supply ledger in my usual careful hand, and I did not say anything to Callum that evening or the evening after that. I needed to understand more before I could say it correctly. I needed to be sure of what I was saying and what I was asking and what I was offering, because once said, it could not be unsaid, and the shape of what came after would depend on how it was said. I was not a person who rushed toward words. I never had been. I waited. Heartland arrived on a Tuesday in late November, 11 days before the first serious snow closed the road entirely. I heard the horses before I saw them. 2 horses rather than 1, which meant he had brought someone with him. Through the window, I watched them come up the final approach to the cabin, Heartland in front, on a horse too well bred for this kind of terrain, the second man behind him on a more practical animal. Heartland was wearing the same kind of expensive coat he had worn in Crestwood, the dark wool with the fur collar, the coat that announced its cost to anyone who saw it. His hair was in order. He rode the way men ride who have always had good horses and have never had to care for them personally. Callum was outside splitting wood when they came into the clearing. I watched through the window as he set the axe down and stood and waited without moving toward them, which told me something, the stillness of it, because stillness of that particular kind is its own communication. I moved to the door and opened it and stood in the frame. Harlan dismounted and said Callum's name with the warmth of a man greeting a business associate at a dinner, as though they were friends who had simply not seen each other in a while, and was that not a shame? He said my name next, and when he did, he looked at me with the same careful cataloging attention he had applied to the supply shelves behind me, though he was better at concealing the cataloging than he probably believed he was. "Just checking on things," Harlan said, "making sure everyone's getting on well." "The transaction is settled," Callum said. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, not raised, not aggressive, but compressed the way a rope compresses when weight is placed on it. "There's nothing to check on. Transactions have long tails." Harlan's smile did not change. It was not a smile that was capable of changing because it was not actually a smile. It was a shape that a practiced man's face makes when he wants to appear at ease. "I heard you've been busy up here. A lot of patients. A lot of people talking about what you've done for them." He stepped toward the cabin door, and I did not move from the frame immediately, which required him to acknowledge me directly before he came through. "You're looking well," he said to me. "Mountain air suits you." I moved aside, not because I was giving way to him, but because blocking a doorway is a gesture with limited duration, and I had already made the point of it. Inside, Harlan moved the way he always moved, with the ease of a man in a space he considers to be in some essential way his. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the table. His eyes moved across the room in a pattern that was too organized to be casual observation, and when they reached the highest shelf, they paused just a fraction longer than they paused anywhere else, and then moved on. 11 days later, I was still thinking about that pause. I was in the main room the evening after Harlan left, sitting at the table with Edgar's notebook open in front of me. I had taken it down for the first time since I put it back, because I had decided I understood enough now to say what needed to be said. I had spent 11 days watching Callum and watching myself, and understanding the shape of what we were in the middle of, and the shape of it required honesty that I had been withholding, and did not have the right to withhold any longer. Callum came in from outside, where he had been checking the water supply, which froze in the pipes when the temperature dropped below a certain point, and required a specific preventative measure that he conducted every evening in the cold months. He came in and stopped when he saw the notebook on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. "You found it," he said, 11 days ago. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was waiting to see if you would tell me yourself." I kept my voice level, not accusatory, because I was not trying to prosecute him. I was trying to understand the ground we were both standing on. "You didn't." So I kept waiting until I understood enough to say it correctly. He came to the table and sat down across from me. He did not reach for the notebook. He looked at it between us in a way that told me he had looked at it many times before, that it was something he had been living with for a long time, the weight of it distributed across years, until the weight had become so habitual he had almost stopped noticing it was there. "How much did you read?" he asked. "All of it that I could make out. The last 30 pages are the problem. Water damage on the left margins. Some of the notation is obscured." "I know. I've tried. I can read my father's medical shorthand, but not when half the characters are missing." "I can read it," I said. He looked up. "The pattern of the notation. The way he structures his compound formulations. I've been reading deteriorated pharmaceutical documents since my second year at Mercer's. Labels that had been wet and dried. Prescription records that had been stored badly. You learn to reconstruct from context from the pattern of what surrounds the damaged section." I held his gaze. "I can read those pages." He was quiet. The fire in the stove shifted and the sound of it filled the room for a moment. "Tell me what you know," I said. "Tell me about Harlan and your father and the formula, all of it." He told me. His father had built a medical practice in Helena after finishing his training in St. Louis. The practice had started with the patients. A young physician builds a reputation through ordinary people, workers, families, the kind of patients who pay what they can and recommend you to others. As the practice grew, it attracted better-paying clients, legislators and businessmen, and the wives of mining company owners, and with those clients came the stability and the resources that allowed Edgar to pursue the research that had always been his real interest. The research had begun in the early 1870s, after Edgar spent 3 weeks treating the survivors of a mine collapse north of Helena and watched several men die in more pain than necessary because there was not enough laudanum in the county to go around. And what there was had produced in the men who received it over the preceding weeks the particular dependency that made its withdrawal another form of suffering. He believed there was a better option available in the natural compounds he had been studying, and he began working toward it. Heartland had come to him in 1874, introduced by a mutual acquaintance, presenting himself as a man interested in supporting important medical work. The support he offered was real money for materials, access to a proper workspace, assistance with procurement. What he wanted in return was described in the contract as a share of what the research produced. Edgar had read the contract. He had not read it carefully enough. What Heartland meant by share it became clear in subsequent years was ownership, not partnership, not acknowledgement. Ownership, the kind that carried with it the right to decide what happened to the formula, who received it at what price, and under what conditions. When Edgar's research progressed to the point where the formula was becoming real, becoming something that could be reproduced and distributed, Heartland arrived with lawyers and revised understanding of what their agreement had said. They had fought about it. The word fought is precise, not a physical altercation, but the sustained grinding conflict of two men who want irreconcilable things from the same object, one of whom has legal resources and patience as weapons, and the other of whom has principle and an increasingly precarious financial position as his. Heartland cut the funding. The wealthy clients, sensitive to the social pressures that a man like Heartland could apply without appearing to apply them, began finding other physicians. Edgar's practice contracted and then failed. And when it failed, Heartland's lawyers produced documents claiming that the failure constituted a breach of the original agreement, and that therefore all research materials and results were forfeit to Heartland as compensation. They took everything: the laboratory equipment, the records, the preliminary documentation. They did not take the notebook because Edgar had not kept it at the practice. He had kept it at the home of a woman who had been his patient for years and who had stored it without knowing what it was. And after the lawyers finished their work, he had retrieved it and brought it with him to Widow's Peak, where Callum was already living. Had already been living for a year, having come up after his father's first serious illness, and never found a reason to go back down. Edgar had lived on Widow's Peak for 2 more years. He had worked on the formula in the cabin with what supplies Callum could bring up from below, without the resources the Helena practice had provided, doing what he could for as long as he could. The last 30 pages were written during the final months when his hands were no longer entirely reliable. When Edgar died, Callum buried him behind the cabin and stayed. He spent 12 years, Callum said. He had been looking at his hands while he spoke most of it, not avoiding my eyes, but speaking to the table the way people speak when they are saying things they have not said aloud before, and the surface in front of them is a useful neutral point. 12 years on that formula. It works. I know it works because I tested the earlier completed formulations on patients who would have been given laudanum otherwise, and the results were different, better, without the dependency. And Heartland knows it exists. He's known for 9 years that my father kept something back. He doesn't know exactly what or exactly where, but he knows enough to look. He didn't send me up here by accident, I said. No. He knew I had pharmaceutical training. He knew I could identify what was in the notebook. He chose me specifically and then manufactured the reason to send me here. Yes. Callum looked up. Are you going to give it to him? I looked at him across the table. At the question, which was direct and fair, which acknowledged without ceremony that there were 2 possible answers and that the choice between them was mine. I found it 11 days ago, I said. I put it back exactly where it was. I said nothing to anyone. I know. Then you already know the answer. He held my gaze. Something in his expression shifted, not much, but something that had been present in it for 11 days. Something careful and watchful that was not distrust exactly, but was adjacent to it, released its position slightly. The last 30 pages, he said. I can read them. If you're wrong about being able to read them, then we'll know more than we know now, and we'll find another way. I set my hand flat on the table, not toward him, just flat on the surface between us, a gesture of ground rather than of reaching. Your father spent 12 years. Maggie Cole is dying right now because Harlan spent 9 years making sure this formula stayed out of circulation. That is a fact, and it will keep being a fact for every patient who needs this and doesn't have it while we wait. He did not answer immediately. The fire in the stove shifted again. Outside, the wind was beginning, the kind of wind that came before serious snow, not violent but persistent, finding every gap in the cabin walls and making itself known through them. "Tell me what you need," he said finally. "Time and light. Good lamp oil. Your knowledge to check my reconstruction against as I go. When I read a damaged section, I'll tell you what I think it says, and you verify whether it fits the medical logic of what surrounds it." That could work. It will work. I was not performing confidence. I had assessed my own capability as accurately as I could, and this was the result of that assessment. How long do we have before Harlan makes a formal move? I don't know. He's been patient for 9 years. But something brought him up here this fall, and it wasn't checking on his investment. Callum paused. He'll move when he has a mechanism, when he finds the legal instrument that lets him take what he wants without appearing to simply take it. Then we need to be ready before he finds it. I closed the notebook and held it on the table between my hands. We finished the formula. We document everything your father did, every step complete and clear, and then we get it out of this cabin and into the hands of people who can protect it. A medical journal. If they'll take it, they'll take it. My father's name carries weight in that community, even after everything Harlan did to the Helena practice. There were people who knew what happened there and knew whose fault it was. He was quiet for a moment. It would take months. The submission, the review. We'd need to proceed carefully. We have the winter, I said. The road closes in 2 weeks. Once it closes, Harlan can't reach us until spring. That gives us until spring. Then we use it. Outside, the wind had picked up. Snow was coming, the real snow, the kind that would be several feet deep by morning and would seal the mountain off from everything below it for the next 4 months. It was not a comforting sound, but it was a useful one. It meant that whatever was coming, we had time before it arrived. Enough time if we worked to be ready for it. I thought about the first morning in the cabin, sitting on the floor with my back against the cabinet, watching the light change. I had not known yet what any of it was going to become. I was beginning to know now. Callum reached across the table and picked up the notebook. Not from me, we had not been holding it together. He picked it up from the surface between us. He held it the way his father had probably held it, familiar, weighted the object of a great deal of accumulated thought. "My father wrote something in the front cover," he said, "inside the binding, not on the pages. I found it after he died." He opened the cover and tilted it toward the lamp, and I leaned forward and read the penciled words inside the binding, small and cramped, and written in a hand that was steadier than the last 30 pages written before the illness had progressed as far. "The formula belongs to medicine, not to any one man. Whoever finishes this, finish it right." I sat back. The fire in the stove, the wind at the walls, the lamp throwing its yellow light across the table where the notebook lay open between us, 12 years of work and one sentence at the front of it. "We'll finish it right," I said. Callum closed the cover. "We start tomorrow. First light." Tomorrow came with 2 feet of snow and a sky the color of iron, and the road to Crestwood completely gone beneath the white. The mountain sealed itself around us the way it did every winter, the way it had sealed itself around Edgar Greer when he was alive and working at this table with this notebook and this same view of nothing but snow and sky through the window. We lit the lamps, and we started. The work of the winter was the most concentrated work I had ever done. We sat at the table each morning after the basic maintenance of the cabin was finished, the water supply checked and the fire managed, and the patients who arrived despite the snow, because some always did, seen and treated and settled. And then we worked. Callum would identify the damaged sections, read to me what was legible on either side, and I would take the section itself and work it from the pattern. I was right that I could read it. I had known I was right, but the proof of it was satisfying. Nonetheless, the way a correctly filled prescription is satisfying, not glamorous, just correct. A partial character here, a smeared notation there, the surrounding logical structure telling you what must go between them, if the compound formula is to make sense, if the ratios are to work, if what Edgar was reaching for, is to cohere into something that can be reproduced by a physician with standard materials.
I feel 10 pounds
Page
lighter.
by page, through December,
Mountains are calling
through
our
January,
names. Let's
through
ride south.
February. We did not speak very much about anything except the work during those months, and what we spoke about outside the work was the natural conversation of two people who share a space and a project and have begun to understand each other's rhythms well enough not to need to fill every silence. I learned that Callum woke earlier than I did and that the coffee was always made by the time I came out. I learned that he went outside every evening for 20 minutes regardless of weather. A necessity rather than a habit, the particular discipline of a man who carries other people's suffering for a living and has learned he must set it down at intervals or it accumulates into something that compromises the work. He learned that I kept the records more obsessively than he did because an imperfect record had already cost me something I could not recover, which was the ability to help Maggie Cole in time, and I was not going to let imperfect records cost me anything again. He learned that I did not need reassurance, but that I registered acknowledgement that when he said the work was right or the approach was correct. It was not flattery I was receiving, but information data about whether my assessment of my own performance matched reality, and I needed that data the way anyone needs accurate feedback in order to calibrate accurately. In February, Maggie Cole came up the mountain for the last
I know
time.
it's complicated,
Tom
but I
Cole
wanna
brought her on a
stay.
day when the snow had crusted hard enough to support a horse and sled, which was the only way travel was possible that time of year. She was carried inside and placed on the padded examination surface, and she was very small, smaller than I had understood was possible for a person who had been present in a room as recently as October. The disease had completed what it had been doing for the better part of a year.
Excuse me, we are ready
There
for
was
you
nothing
now.
to do except what we had been doing for the past months. The management of pain, the making of what remained as bearable as it could be made. Callum prepared what was needed. I sat with her while he did. We talked, Maggie and I, and what we talked about I will not record here because it was hers, not mine to record. She died 4 days later in the supply room we had converted to a patient room with her father sleeping in the chair beside her and the mountain quiet outside. I was the one who went to get Callum when it happened. I walked through the dark cabin to the foot of the loft stairs, and I said his name once at normal volume, and he was down the stairs in less than a minute because he always slept lightly when there was a patient in the cabin. After Tom Cole had been spoken to and the necessary things had been done, I sat at the table in the main room. The notebook was on the shelf where we kept it, now accessible, no longer sealed. The lamp was low. Callum came and sat beside me, not across from me, beside me, pulling his chair close enough that I was aware of his presence as a physical warmth in the cold room. I did not cry. Grief for me comes in stillness rather than in movement. And I sat still, and I sat still, and he sat with me, and after a while he said the thing that was true without dressing it up. She was not going to make it, not in 1887, not anywhere. I know. The formula doesn't change that. It would have managed her pain better. That's real, and it matters. But it would not have changed the outcome. I know that too. I looked at the shelf where the notebook sat. But Jesse is 12 years old and he has something different, and something different means something different is possible. And every person after Jesse. He was quiet for a moment. We're close. I know we're close. Another 3 weeks, maybe 4. Then we finish it, I said. And then we make sure Harlan never touches it. It was not a question of whether to fight. We had already decided that without using the word decide, it was only a question of being ready before the snow melted and the road opened, and whatever Harlan had been preparing during the months he could not reach us came up the mountain with the spring. We went back to work the next morning, and the morning after that, because that was what there was to do. And because the notebook on the shelf was 12 years of one man's refusal to let a better thing be owned by a worse purpose, and we were not going to be the ones who let that end. The snow melted slowly through March. By the first week of April, the track was passable for a determined rider. By the second week, it was passable for a wagon. On the 14th day of April, a letter arrived. It was delivered by a rider from Crestwood, one of the young men who carried mail up to the cabin when the season allowed, who handed it to Callum at the door with the expression of someone who does not know what he is carrying, but can tell from the wax seal and the paper quality that it is not an ordinary piece of correspondence. Callum read it standing in the doorway. I watched his face. I did not need to read it to understand what it contained. I had been waiting for it since November. He brought it inside and set it on the table, and I picked it up and read it. Harlan had been busy during the winter. 2 claims sent simultaneously timed for the moment the road opened. The first was a land claim. Documents, he said, proving his purchase of the Widow's Peak territory from the Federal Land Office in 1873, predating Callum's presence by 6 years. 30 days to vacate or face legal proceedings. The second was a claim on the research itself. The original funding contract he maintained granted him ownership of all research produced by Edgar Greer during the period of their agreement. The notebook and its contents were his property. He demanded their return within the same 30 days. I set the letter down. "He's been preparing both of these all winter," I said. "Yes. The land claim and the research claim together. If we fight one, we're distracted from the other. That's the design." I sat down. I thought about it carefully, the way I thought about a damaged page in the notebook, working from what I knew on either side of the gap toward what must logically occupy the middle. "The land claim," I said. "He bought land in 1873 that didn't exist on a federal survey until 1875. That's a forgery. It can be proven with public records." "The records are in Helena, in the land office. They're public documents. Anyone can access them. I can access them." "And the research contract?" "That requires the original document and a witness to what was in it." I looked at him. "Your father had it typed by someone, a clerk or a typist. Do you know who?" Callum thought. "There was a man he used for legal documents, in Helena, an older man, Arthur Penn. He was a court clerk before he retired." "Would he remember?" "My father's contract was unusual. He insisted on a specific clause that the man said he had never typed before. An explicit statement that the research findings would be made freely available to the medical community upon completion." He paused. "Penn told my father it was the most idealistic thing he had ever been asked to put in a legal document. People remember unusual things. He would be 70 or more now. 70-year-old men who were court clerks remember their documents." I picked up the letter again and looked at it, at the confident, unhurried handwriting of a man who has spent all winter preparing and believes he has prepared enough. "We go to Helena. You find Arthur Penn. I go to the land office and I find the survey records. We walk into that hearing with what we find and we put it in front of a judge. We don't have a lawyer. We have evidence. Sometimes evidence is enough." Callum looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the shelf where the notebook sat completed. Now the last pages finally decoded and documented the formula whole and clear and recorded in my handwriting alongside his father's. "The formula," he said. "We send copies before we leave. To the journal in Denver that expressed interest in your father's earlier work. Send it with a letter explaining the history. Even if Harlan moves against us at the hearing, if the formula is already in the hands of the journal, he cannot claim private ownership of something that has already been submitted for public record." "When did you plan all of this?" "Slowly, over the winter." I looked at him, and I told him the truth. Since the day I found the notebook and understood what Harlan had sent me here to do, I have been planning what to do instead. He was quiet for a moment that stretched. Outside, the spring wind moved through the trees, a different sound from the winter wind, lighter, less insistent. The mountain was opening again. The road was open. Whatever was coming, was coming. "All right," he said. "We go to Helena." I nodded. We had 3 weeks left in the 30 days Harlan had given us. 3 weeks to gather what we needed and make the journey and stand in front of a territorial judge with the truth and see whether the truth on this particular occasion was going to be enough. I thought it was. I could not be certain, but I had assessed the evidence. We had the survey records and Arthur Penn's memory and the journal submission and the pattern of Harlan's behavior that my father had described to a courtroom in his own words, and I thought the truth carefully presented was going to be enough. I was not in the habit of acting on certainties. Certainties are rarer than people claim them to be. I was in the habit of acting on careful assessment on everything I could know applied as rigorously as I was capable of, and then doing the work and seeing what the work produced. Tonight the lamp was burning and the formula was complete on the shelf above us. Outside, the spring wind was finding the gaps in the cabin walls, the same walls that had held through the winter, and we were still inside them. Tomorrow we would start preparing for Helena. We blew out the lamp at the same time, which neither of us had planned. They left Widow's Peak on a Thursday morning in the third week of April, when the road had dried enough to take a loaded wagon without losing it to mud on the switchbacks. Callum had arranged for a neighbor, a homesteader named Fisk, who lived 2 miles down the eastern slope, and owed Callum a debt of the practical kind to look in on the cabin every other day while they were gone. There were no patients currently in residence. The last one, a trapper with a badly set wrist that Callum had broken and reset correctly, had left 4 days prior. Nora spent the 2 days before departure copying the formula. Not once but twice in her cleanest and most deliberate hand, the handwriting she used when precision mattered more than speed. One copy went into an envelope addressed to a medical journal in Denver that had published 2 of Edgar Greer's earlier papers, accompanied by a letter in Callum's name explaining the provenance of the work and requesting urgent consideration. The letter described what the formula was, what it did, and what its relationship to Victor Harlan's funding had been in plain and specific language that left nothing to interpretation. The second copy went into a waterproof oilskin pouch that Nora kept in her bag for the journey. If the first copy was lost or delayed or intercepted by some means, Harlan might have available to him the second existed. If the second was somehow lost, the original notebook remained in the cabin in the sealed jar on the highest shelf where Harlan's people had not found it in 9 years and were not likely to find it in the weeks they would be away. The original letter to the Denver Journal was sent on the Wednesday before departure, carried down the mountain by the same young writer who had brought Harlan's letter up. He was paid extra for the errand and instructed to deliver it directly to the postmaster's hands rather than leaving it in the general collection. Whether this was sufficient precaution, Nora could not be certain. It was the best available precaution, which was the standard she applied to everything. The journey to Helena took 5 days. The territorial capital was situated in a valley to the northeast, connected to the Bitterroot country by roads that were better maintained than the tracks Nora had become accustomed to, but that still reflected the realities of mountain travel in spring, which meant stretches of good surface interrupted by stretches of mud and one section of road near a river crossing that had partially washed out and required them to take a longer route around. They spoke during the journey, which was different from how they had spoken during the winter. The winter's conversation had been primarily functional, organized around the work, and when it moved outside the work, it moved carefully in the way of 2 people still learning the edges of what could be said between them. The journey to Helena had a different quality. There was a particular freedom and forward motion in the fact of leaving one place and moving toward another with a specific purpose that loosened something in both of them. Callum told her more about his father. Not the facts, she knew the facts, but the texture of the man, the small specific things that make a person real rather than a story. Edgar Greer had been a poor sleeper, prone to waking at 3 in the morning and lighting a lamp and reading until dawn rather than lying in the dark trying to force sleep back. He had kept meticulous records of the weather at every location he had ever lived, not for any scientific purpose, but because he found weather interesting in itself, the patterns of it, the way it behaved differently in different elevations and landscapes. He had been an indifferent cook who ate whatever was available without apparent preference, except that he could not tolerate the taste of mint in any form, which had caused occasional problems when well-meaning patients brought him mint preparations as payment for his services. Nora told him about her mother. This was harder. Not because the grief was still sharp, 10 years had softened the sharpness, but because she had not spoken about her mother to anyone in so long that the words came out with the particular resistance of things that have been kept still for a long time and must be moved carefully to avoid breaking something. Her mother had been a reader. In a town like Crestwood, where books were not practical objects, and women who spent time reading them were considered to be putting on airs, her mother had read anyway, ordering books from a catalog when she could afford them, and borrowing from the schoolteacher's small collection when she could not. She had taught Nora to read before Nora was old enough for school and had made it clear without ever stating it as a rule that reading was not a pastime, but a tool, something that expanded the range of what a person could understand and therefore the range of what a person could do. The pharmacy training had come from reading. The medical texts during slow afternoons at Mercer's had come from reading. The notebook under the counter with Maggie's symptoms recorded in careful clinical language had come from reading from knowing the language of medicine well enough to use it even without the credentials that were supposed to be required before it was used. She would have liked you, Nora said, and then stopped because she had not planned to say that and was not sure it was the right thing to have said. Callum was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was actually considering what had been said, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. What makes you think so? She had a talent for recognizing people who were trying to do something real. She didn't have much patience for performance. Nora looked at the road ahead. You don't perform. I don't know how, he said, which was the most unguarded thing she had heard him say in 7 months. They arrived in Helena on the 5th evening and found a boarding house near the courthouse district that charged reasonable rates and did not ask more questions than were necessary. Helena was larger than any town Nora had been in before. The streets were paved in the commercial district, which still surprised her each time she looked down at them. Buildings 3 and 4 stories tall, a streetcar line on the main avenue, the compressed, purposeful movement of a place that considered itself the center of something. She had spent her entire life in Crestwood. The scale of Helena was not overwhelming, but it was unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity required attention, which she gave it. She observed the city the way she observed everything, noting what was useful and setting aside what was not. The following morning they divided. Callum went in search of Arthur Penn. Nora went to the Territorial Land Office. The land office occupied the ground floor of a government building on the east side of the courthouse square, a solid stone structure that smelled of dust and old paper in the particular way of rooms where documents are stored for years. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with an ink stain on his right cuff who looked up when Nora came in and waited with the particular patience of someone accustomed to members of the public arriving with requests that took longer to process than the requester expected. I need to access the survey records for the Bitterroot district, Nora said. Specifically, the records for the area designated as Widow's Peak on the eastern slope. I need to know when that area was formally surveyed and opened for private land claims. The clerk asked for a filing fee, which she paid. He disappeared into the back of the building for approximately 15 minutes and returned with a large bound volume that he set on the counter and opened to a section marked with a paper tab. Survey records for that area are public record, he said. You're welcome to review them here. She reviewed them there. The records were dense with the technical language of land survey and property law, but the essential information was not difficult to extract once you knew what you were looking for. The Widow's Peak area, including the eastern slope where Callum's cabin stood, had been formally surveyed by a federal survey team and entered into the Territorial Land Registry on March 14, 1875. Prior to that date, it had been designated as unsurveyed wilderness, which meant it was not available for private purchase or homestead claim. March 14, 1875. Victor Harlan's land claim document stated a purchase date of 1873. 2 years before the land existed in any legally transactable form. Nora asked the clerk to produce a certified copy of the relevant survey record, which was a standard request and which he fulfilled without comment, applying the official stamp of the land office and noting the date of certification. She paid the additional fee for the certified copy and put it carefully in the oilskin pouch alongside the formula. She walked back to the boarding house and sat at the small desk in the room and looked at what she had in front of her. The certified survey record, the copy of the formula, the patient records and tax receipts from Widow's Peak that she had organized and brought with her, 2 years of documentation establishing continuous occupancy and operation. She thought about what Callum had said about Harlan's land claim document. He had seen it referenced in Harlan's letter but had not seen the document itself. Neither had she. What she had was the record that made the document impossible, the record that showed the land could not have been purchased in 1873 because it did not legally exist for purchase in 1873. That was not the same as having the forged document in hand. But in a territorial court, faced with a certified federal survey record on one side and a private purchase claim on the other, the question of which one carried more weight was not a complicated question. The issue was the research contract. That was the more difficult piece. Land records were public and objective. Contract disputes required testimony credibility, the human variable of who a judge was inclined to believe. She was still thinking about it when Callum returned in the late afternoon. He had found Arthur Penn. The man was 71 years
Better
old
than yesterday.
and lived in a small
The
house in
swelling
a
has
quiet
come down
street south of the main
significantly.
commercial district, tended a kitchen garden that was just beginning to show its spring growth, and had the particular clarity of mind that some people retain in old age by virtue of having kept it in regular use. He had been a court clerk and then a private legal secretary for 35 years, and he
I know it's
remembered Edgar
complicated,
Greer's
but I wanna
contract
stay.
because, as Callum had predicted, it was
Stay then.
unusual enough to be memorable.
Figure the rest out.
He said Penn was willing to testify, Callum told her. They were sitting across from each other at the small desk, the certified survey record between them. He remembers the clause specifically, said it was the first time in his career anyone had insisted on including language requiring free public distribution of intellectual work.
We are ready for you
He said
now.
Edgar Greer argued with Harlan's representative about it for 45 minutes before the representative agreed to include it. Harlan's version of the contract doesn't have the clause. Penn's testimony establishes that the original did, which means Harlan's version was altered after the fact. A judge will have to decide which account to credit. Penn was a court clerk for 20 years. His professional reputation was built on accurate transcription of legal documents. Harlan's reputation in this territory is... Callum paused. Harlan is known. What he is known for is not uncomplicated. Nora looked at the survey record. The land claim is the stronger piece of evidence. It's documentary, not testimonial. Harlan cannot argue with a federal survey date. No. The contract is testimonial, but Penn's credibility as a witness is significant. I think so. Together they make a case. She looked at him. We need to request a hearing, tomorrow if possible. I spoke to a clerk at the courthouse this afternoon. There's a judge hearing territorial matters this week. Judge Wade Colton. The clerk said he has a reputation for impatience with procedural games and a history of ruling against land fraud claims. Good, Nora said. Then we request a hearing before Judge Colton. The hearing was set for the following Thursday, 6 days away. Harlan, informed through the proper legal channels that a counterclaim had been filed, arrived in Helena on the Tuesday before it. Nora saw him from the window of the boarding house when his party came down the main street, 3 lawyers in good coats, and Harlan himself unhurried, looking like a man who has done this before and expects to do it again. He had done this before. That was the fact of it, and she did not look away from it. He had done this before, and he had resources and experience and the particular confidence of someone who has almost never lost anything he decided to pursue. What she had was a certified federal survey record, a 71-year-old former court clerk, 2 years of meticulous patient records, and the fact that the truth was on her side, which was not always sufficient, but was the foundation without which nothing else could be built. She spent the 6 days preparing. Not in a frantic way, but in the methodical way she approached every task that required precision, working through what she would say and in what order, anticipating the objections that Harlan's lawyers would raise and thinking through the responses to each one. Callum worked alongside her, providing the medical and historical context that she needed to understand fully before she could present it accurately. They were not allowed legal representation in the formal sense, not having the funds for a territorial lawyer, but the judge had the discretion to allow parties to speak on their own behalf in matters before his court, particularly in the territory where formal legal representation was not always available or practical. Callum had confirmed this through the courthouse clerk. On the Thursday morning, Nora, dressed in the dark blue dress that was her best, the one she had brought in her bag when she left Crestwood 7 months ago, the most formal thing she owned. She pinned her hair neatly. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and she saw what she saw, which was herself. 194 pounds of woman who had been told for 25 years that this was the most important thing about her, and she looked at it and set it aside and thought about what she was walking into and what she needed to do there. The courthouse was a stone building on the north side of the square. The hearing room was on the second floor, reached by a wooden staircase that creaked at every step. It was a medium-sized room with benches along the walls for observers and a central floor where the parties would stand and a raised bench at the front where Judge Colton sat with the solid, unhurried presence of a man who has conducted a great many hearings and found the experience neither glamorous nor tedious, but simply the work. He was perhaps 60 years old, gray-haired, with a face that had settled into the particular expression of someone who has heard a great many versions of the truth and developed over the years a fairly reliable sense of which versions deserved more weight than others. Harlan and his 3 lawyers occupied the right side of the floor. They had a table and a considerable quantity of organized paperwork. They had the posture of people who expected to win, which is a different posture from confidence. Confidence comes from knowing what you have. The expectation of winning comes from not imagining that the other side has anything significant. Callum and Nora stood on the left. Arthur Penn sat on the bench closest to them, his hands on his knees, his back straight in the manner of a man who had spent decades in professional settings and had not lost the habit of correct posture. Judge Colton opened the hearing without ceremony. He gave a brief description of the matter before the court, a land claim dispute and a contract dispute, both brought by Victor Harlan against Callum Greer and his wife, both to be heard and decided on the basis of evidence presented. Harlan's lead lawyer spoke first. He was a smooth-voiced man named Aldrich, who had clearly done this many times and whose presentation had the well-oiled quality of a mechanism designed for this specific purpose. He presented the land claim document, a substantial piece of paper with official-looking stamps and signatures, and he described it as proof of Harlan's prior ownership of the Widow's Peak territory. He presented the research contract, or Harlan's version of it, and described it as proof of Harlan's ownership of all research produced during the period of Edgar Greer's funding. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes, organized and persuasive, and when he finished, he had constructed a version of events that was coherent and well-documented and almost entirely false. Judge Colton looked at Callum. "Your response. And if your wife has technical knowledge relevant to the evidence, this court will hear from her in the capacity of an expert witness on pharmaceutical and land record matters, not as legal counsel, as a person with direct, relevant expertise. Is that your intention?" "It is, Your Honor," Callum said. "Then proceed." Callum spoke first about the land. He described his arrival at Widow's Peak in 1879, his construction of the cabin, the 8 years of continuous occupancy and operation, the taxes paid to the territorial assessor every year without exception. He presented the receipts organized by year, each one stamped by the assessor's office. Then he turned to Nora. She stepped forward. She had not rehearsed this in the sense of memorizing words. She had thought through the logic of it until the logic was so clear to her that the words that expressed it were simply the natural result of understanding it fully. "Your Honor," she said, "Mr. Harlan's land claim document states a purchase date of 1873. I have here a certified copy of the Federal Survey record for the Widow's Peak area issued by this territory's land office, which shows that the area was not formally surveyed and entered into the land registry until March 14, 1875. She placed the certified copy on the surface available to the judge. Aldrich was already on his feet, but Judge Colton raised one hand without looking at him, and Aldrich sat back down. The judge read the survey record. He read it with the care of someone who understands what he is reading and is verifying that he has understood it correctly. Then he looked at Harlan's land claim document. Then he looked back at the survey record. "A purchase cannot precede the availability of the land for purchase," the judge said. It was not a question. "No, Your Honor," Nora said. "A land claim dated 1873 for territory that did not enter the Federal Registry until 1875 is not possible under the Homestead Act or the territorial land statutes." "Mr. Aldrich," the judge said. Aldrich produced a technical objection about survey record accuracy and the possibility of administrative discrepancy in the dating of federal documents. The objection was articulate, and it was also, in Nora's assessment, the best available argument for a position that had no good arguments available for it. A federal survey record certified by the Territorial Land Office was not susceptible to the kind of doubt that Aldrich was attempting to introduce, and she could see in the judge's expression that he understood this. "The discrepancy is 2 years, Judge Colton said. He looked at Aldrich with the expression of a man who has heard a great many technical objections and developed a reliable sense of which ones deserved exploration and which ones were scaffolding around a hole in the floor. "Administrative discrepancy does not generally run to 2 years in the wrong direction." Aldrich sat down. Nora returned to her position beside Callum. She could feel that the land claim was decided not formally, not yet, but decided in the only way that mattered, which was in the mind of the person with the authority to decide it. The research contract was more complicated, and it took longer. Aldrich presented Harlan's version with careful emphasis on the language of ownership that it contained, which was broad and sweeping in the way of language drafted by lawyers who are trying to claim everything available. Callum presented his father's version, which contained the public distribution clause. Two contracts incompatible with each other. The judge read both. Then Arthur Penn was asked to speak. He stood with some effort, a 71-year-old man rising from a bench, and he straightened when he was upright in the automatic way of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms and had not entirely forgotten it. He described the circumstances of the contract's preparation in 1879. He described Edgar Greer's insistence on the public distribution clause. He described the 45 minutes of argument with Harlan's representative before the clause was agreed to and included. "You typed the original document yourself?" Judge Colton asked. "I did, Your Honor. Dr. Greer would not trust it to anyone else once the clause was agreed. He wanted to be present while it was typed and to review it before signing." "And the document before the court presented by Mr. Harlan's counsel does not contain the clause I typed," Penn said. "The version before the court is not the document I prepared." Aldrich objected. He objected at some length, raising questions about the reliability of an elderly man's recollection of a document prepared 14 years ago. The objection was not without merit, as objections go, but it was undermined by the specific quality of Arthur Penn's testimony, the way he had named the exact duration of the argument, and the specific language of the clause, and the name of Harlan's representative who had been present. This was not the testimony of a man reconstructing a vague recollection. It was the testimony of a man describing something unusual enough to have remained precise. Judge Colton did not rule immediately on the contract question. He said he would consider both the documentary evidence and the testimony and issue his ruling in writing within the week. This was the standard procedure for the more complex question. Before Judge Colton could move to the land claim, the door at the back of the hearing room opened. Everyone turned. The bailiff near the door straightened with the automatic authority of someone whose job includes preventing exactly this kind of interruption. But the man who came through was not moving with drama or urgency. He was moving the way a man moves when he has decided to do something difficult and has committed to it before his nerve fails. Clem Price was thinner than Nora had seen him in years. Clean clothes, not fine ones. His hands, visible from where she stood, were not shaking. Judge Colton looked at him over his papers. "This hearing is in session. State your business or take a seat." "I have information relevant to the contract matter," Clem said. His voice was steady in the way that steadiness costs something to maintain. "My name is Clem Price. I'm the man who signed the original debt agreement with Victor Harlan, the one that put my daughter in this room." Harlan's lawyer Aldrich was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this man has no standing in this proceeding." "He has standing as a witness," Judge Colton said. "Sit down, Mr. Aldrich." He looked at Clem. "You have 5 minutes. Be specific." Clem did not look at Nora. She understood why. If he looked at her, he might not be able to say what he had come to say. He described the hospital room in the winter of 1885. The number of the room. The flowers Harlan had brought, which he remembered, were yellow because yellow seemed wrong for what the visit actually was. He described the paper placed on the blanket over his legs and the pen set beside it. He described asking what he was signing and being told formalities, just formalities, and signing because he was in pain and frightened, and the man standing over his hospital bed had already saved his life once, and he did not have the clarity left to question him. "He said, 'Sign here and your girl's safe,'" Clem said. "I asked what I was signing. He said, 'Just formalities.'" He stopped. "I'm not here to say that makes it right. I know it doesn't. I'm here because somebody should say out loud what actually happened in that room." Judge Colton looked at Harlan. Harlan was looking at the table in front of him. "Mr. Harlan," the judge said, "do you wish to respond?" Harlan's lawyer leaned close and spoke in his ear. Harlan shook his head slightly. "No response," Aldrich said. Judge Colton wrote something in his notes. "Thank you, Mr. Price," he said. "You may be seated." Clem turned to find a seat. As he did, his eyes passed over Nora for one moment. He did not stop walking. She did not say anything. She held his gaze for the second it lasted, which was the most she had to give him right then, and he took it and looked away and sat down. The land claim he disposed of at the end of the hearing. "The land claim presented by Mr. Harlan cannot be sustained," he said. His voice had not changed in tone or volume throughout the hearing, which was in itself a kind of statement, the evenness of a man who has not been surprised by what he has seen, but has reached a conclusion about it. "A purchase predating the availability of the surveyed land for purchase is not a valid purchase. The claim is dismissed." Mr. Greer's
feels better
occupancy
saying
and
it
tax
out
payment
loud.
records establish a clear and
does.
uncontested right to the property in
I feel
question.
the same way.
He looked at the room over the
Make sure
top of
those
his
crates are
papers.
delivered to the hotel
I
by
am also
noon.
directing
Yes,
a copy
sir,
of
right
this
away.
proceeding to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review of the land claim document's provenance. The discrepancy between the claimed date and the survey date warrants examination. Harlan was on his feet. For the first time in the proceedings, he spoke directly, not through Aldrich, which told Nora something about the degree to which the land ruling had departed from his expectations. Your Honor, the research contract remains before the court, and the issues of intellectual property will be addressed in my written ruling, Judge Colton said, which you will receive along with all other parties. This hearing is concluded. The room began to move. Lawyers gathered papers. Observers who had been sitting along the walls stood and began the low murmur of people processing what they had seen. Arthur Penn sat back down on the bench with the careful deliberateness of a man who trusts the process of sitting down more than he trusts his knees. Harlan crossed the floor. He did not move fast. He moved with the measured pace of a man who has decided that speed signals anxiety, that composure is its own form of power. He stopped in front of Callum and Nora, and he looked at them with the expression of someone recalculating. "This isn't finished," he said. His voice was quiet below the general noise of the room clearing, pitched only for the three of them. "One hearing doesn't finish something like this. I have resources you don't have and time you don't have, and I will continue to pursue what I'm owed until—" "What you're owed," Nora said, "is nothing."
Please,
He
I
looked
didn't
at her.
do it.
It was the first time in all of it
You have
that he
to
looked at her
believe
as
me.
something other than an instrument or an inconvenience. She could not have said exactly what was in the look. She met it the same way she met every look that came at her from a position of presumed power, which was directly and without the performance of either deference or aggression, just directly. "Your father funded research," she said. "He funded it under terms that included a clause requiring free public distribution of the results. That clause was in the contract. It was typed by the man sitting on that bench, and it was signed by your representative. The formula belongs to medicine." She paused. "Those are your father's words." Something shifted in Harlan's expression. Not softening, not backing down. Something more complicated than either of those, the expression of a man who has pursued something for so long that being told it is not his is not simply a
I feel
legal
10 pounds
reversal,
lighter.
but a revision of the story he has been telling himself about who he is and what he deserves. He left without responding. His lawyers followed him, and then the room was nearly empty. Just Callum and Nora and Arthur Penn, who was pulling on his coat with the methodical patience of a man in no particular hurry. "Thank you," Callum said to Penn. The old man looked at him for a moment. "Your father was a good man, impractical in the way that good men sometimes are, but good." He buttoned the top button of his coat. "I'm glad there was something I could still do about it." He walked out slowly, his cane on the stone floor, and then it was just the two of them in the hearing room, with the morning light coming through the windows at a low angle, the dust of the proceedings still settling in the air. Nora looked at the table where the certified survey record still lay, not yet reclaimed. She picked it up and put it back in the oilskin pouch. "The written ruling on the contract," Callum said, "will go in our favor. Penn's testimony was specific enough, and Harlan's version of the contract is too different from what Penn described. Colton is not a man who misses that kind of discrepancy." She closed the pouch. "And if the journal in Denver publishes before the ruling comes, it won't matter what Harlan's contract says. You cannot own a formula that is already in the public
I know it's
domain.
complicated, but I want to stay.
We won't know if they publish for weeks.
Stay then.
Then we wait
We'll
weeks."
figure the rest out.
She looked at him. "We have time now. The land is settled. He cannot remove us from Widow's Peak. Whatever comes next, we face it from there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were right that we had enough. I assessed what we had as accurately as I could," she
Excuse
said.
me, we are
"I'm glad
ready
the
for you
assessment
now."
was accurate." He almost smiled. She had learned to recognize the almost in his expressions, the things his face did when it was moving towards something that it did not fully arrive at. "Come on," he said. "We need to tell Penn where to send his account for the journey." They walked out of the courthouse into the Helena morning, the city moving around them with its usual purposeful noise, and Nora breathed the mountain air that came even here, carried down from the ranges visible to the south, and thought about Widow's Peak and the cabin and the work that was waiting. They were 12 days back on Widow's Peak when the envelope arrived. It came by the same young writer who brought the mail up when the season allowed, tucked into a leather pouch with 3 other pieces of correspondence, and the young man handed it to Nora at the door because Callum was inside with a patient, a woman from the Flathead Valley who had ridden 4 days with a hand infection that had progressed past what Nora would have wished, but not past what could be addressed. The envelope was heavier than a standard letter. The return address was Denver, Colorado. Nora held it for a moment on the porch. The morning was clear, the clear that follows several days of rain when the air has been washed through and everything at a distance is sharp-edged and precise. Below the cabin the valley spread out green and exact, the river a silver line at the bottom of it, the road that led back down to Crestwood visible as a pale thread through the timber. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a printed proof. The proof being the typeset pages of what would appear in the next issue of the journal sent for the author's review before final publication. The letter confirmed acceptance. The letter confirmed publication date. The letter expressed in the formal language of a scientific publication the opinion of the editorial board that the formula represented a significant contribution to the field of pain management and that the accompanying historical notes were of considerable interest to the medical community. The name on the proof was Edgar Greer, M.D., with a note identifying the work as completed posthumously and the completion attributed to Callum Greer and Nora Price Greer. She stood on the porch for a while with the proof in her hand and the valley spread below her and the morning light coming over the eastern ridge. She had not known when she stepped off the pharmacy counter and into Mercer's to fill another prescription for a cough that was not a cough that any of this existed ahead of her. She had not known when she packed a bag in 20 minutes on a Tuesday morning in September that the bag contained the beginning of something rather than the end of something. She had not known when she climbed into Callum Greer's wagon on the north end of the main road of Crestwood that the road they took would go here. She had known standing at the foot of the Bitterroot Range with the town behind her and the mountain ahead that she was choosing the mountain. That was all she had known with certainty. The rest had been work and more work, and the things that grow when two people do difficult work together for long enough that the work becomes something other than just work. Callum appeared in the doorway. He had finished with the patient who would need to stay for several days while the infection cleared under treatment. He looked at the envelope in her hand and at her face, and he waited in the way he always waited, giving her the full space of the moment before he asked anything. She held the proof out to him. He read it standing in the doorway. He read it completely, not moving on until he had understood what was in front of him. She watched his face while he read. He was not a man whose face moved much when he was processing something significant. The significance registered not in expression, but in a kind of stillness, an intensification of the attention that he brought to whatever he was looking at. When he finished, he looked up. "The name," he said. "Price Greer." "It's accurate," she said. "I'm the one who read the damaged pages." "You did more than read the damaged pages." "I know, but that was the part only I could do." She looked at the proof in his hands. "Is it all right? The name—" He looked at it again for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and held it back out to her. "It's exactly right," he said. She took it. She put it back in the envelope. 3 days later, the written ruling from Judge Colton arrived. It was 8 pages and dense with legal language, but the essential content was not ambiguous. The research contract presented by Heartland did not match the original, as described by the witness Arthur Penn, whose testimony the judge found credible by virtue of its specificity and the professional context in which the original document had been prepared. The clause requiring free public distribution of research findings was determined to have been present in the original contract and therefore binding on all parties. Heartland's claim of ownership over the formula and related materials was dismissed. The judge also noted in the ruling's final paragraph that the submission of the formula for publication in a scientific journal completed prior to the hearing and therefore prior to any claim of private ownership being adjudicated placed the formula in the public domain in a manner that would have been conclusive on the ownership question regardless of the contract ruling. This was not a rebuke exactly. It was a judge noting in the dry language of legal rulings that the people on the other side of this case had been thorough. Nora read this paragraph twice. Then she went outside and stood on the porch in the May afternoon and looked at the valley. Jesse Cole came up the mountain the following week. Tom Cole brought him on horseback, the boy behind his father on the saddle, thin and pale in the way of someone who has been sick long enough that their body has had to give up things it preferred to keep. He was 12 years old, and he had been coughing for 5 weeks, and the cough had progressed to the point where eating was difficult and sleeping was difficult, and everything was more difficult than it should be for a 12-year-old boy. Callum examined him. Nora assisted. Then they spoke outside while Jesse rested inside on the patient bed, and what Callum said to Tom Cole was what they had both understood when they first saw the boy. This was not what Maggie had. The disease was different. The disease was treatable. "How long?" Tom Cole asked. He was a man who had buried one child and was not prepared to use more words than were necessary when asking about another one. "Weeks, not months," Callum said. "If he eats well and rests, and we manage the pain during the acute phase so he can sleep." Tom Cole looked at the cabin. He looked at the valley. He looked at his hands. "All right," he said. Jesse Cole stayed on Widow's Peak for 3 weeks. The fever broke at the end of the first week. The cough began to loosen in the second. In the third week he began eating properly, and the color came back to his face in the gradual way that health returns when it has been absent long enough, not all at once but in installments, a little more each day. Nora spent time with him in the evenings when the day's work was done, talking the way she had talked with Maggie about small things, the kinds of things a 12-year-old boy wanted to talk about when he was well enough to want to talk about things. He was curious about the mountains in the specific way of a child who had always lived below them and had not been above the tree line before. She told him what she knew, which was more than she had known 7 months ago, and was accumulating steadily. One evening, near the end of the third week, Jesse asked her why she had come up here. It was a child's question, direct, without the social editing that adults apply to the questions they actually want to ask. She thought about it honestly. "I needed somewhere to do something that mattered," she said. "I didn't know it at the time, but that's what it turned out to be." "Do you like it here?" She looked out the window at the darkening mountain. "Yes," she said. "Very much." He went home at the beginning of June on a bright morning with a sky so clear it was almost white at the edges. Tom Cole loaded him onto the horse, and Callum gave Tom a supply of the compound for the remaining weeks of recovery, enough to see the process through, with written instructions in Nora's clear hand for how it was to be used and in what doses and at what intervals. Tom Cole did not say much before he rode out. He was a man of few words in ordinary circumstances, and the circumstances of the past months had not been ordinary, and he had even fewer available. He shook Callum's hand. He looked at Nora for a long moment with the look of someone who has something large to convey and no reliable method for conveying it. "All right," he said finally. It meant more than it said. Nora watched them ride down the track until the trees closed over the path behind them and there was nothing left to watch. She thought about Maggie. She thought about the notebook under the pharmacy counter that nobody had known about. She thought about the letters to Billings that came back unopened. She thought about standing in the space between what you can see and what you can do about it, which is the particular territory that people occupy when they have knowledge and no authority and no one willing to lend them either. She was not in that territory anymore. The summer brought patients, as it always did, the flow of them increasing with the weather and the increased movement of people through the mountain country. Callum managed the serious cases, and Nora managed an expanding range of the rest, the infections and the injuries and the illnesses that required careful treatment, but not the specific expertise that Callum had accumulated over a decade of frontier medicine. They worked in the established rhythm of people who have learned each other's methods thoroughly enough that the coordination between them requires very little explanation. There were 2 new graves behind the cabin by August. A man who had come too late, the infection already systemic by the time he arrived, and an elderly woman whose heart had simply concluded its work one quiet morning. Callum had buried them as he had buried the others, without ceremony, that he did not know the people well enough to conduct, but with the care of someone who understood that the act of burial was a form of acknowledgement, a statement that the person had been real and had been here and had been treated as though they mattered. Nora helped with both burials. She recorded both deaths in the patient ledger, the dates and the presenting conditions and the treatment attempted, and the outcome in the same careful handwriting she had always used, because the record was the record and it was hers to keep accurately, regardless of whether the outcome was what she had worked toward. The written ruling from Judge Colton's court regarding the broader aspects of Harlan's claims had found its way to the Territorial Attorney General as the judge had directed, and by summer there were proceedings underway in Helena regarding several of Harlan's business arrangements that the examination of the Widow's Peak matter had brought into question. Nora heard about this through the patients who brought news from below along with their injuries, and she noted it the same way she noted everything, as information that was relevant to the situation she was in, without satisfaction that went beyond the simple clarity of a wrong thing being addressed. Harlan himself had not returned to Widow's Peak and had not sent further correspondence. She did not expect this to remain the case permanently. A man with his resources and his disposition toward persistence did not simply conclude that he had been wrong and redirect his energy elsewhere. But whatever came next from that direction would be faced from a stronger position than the one they had occupied when his letter arrived in April. On an evening in late August, they sat on the porch after the day's work was finished. This was not a new habit, but it was a habit the way many things had become habits over the months, small structures that two people build between themselves without deciding to build them, that simply accumulate through repetition until they are part of what the day is. The light was going off the valley below, the last of it catching in the river and in the tops of the furthest trees before it went entirely. The air had the particular warmth of a summer evening at altitude, which is not the same warmth as a valley evening, but is in its own way complete. Callum was repairing a piece of equipment, a leather case for one of the instrument sets that had worn at the seam. His hands moved with the automatic precision of someone doing something familiar while his attention was elsewhere. Nora was reading. She had acquired through a patient who had brought it as partial payment a medical text published the previous year in Philadelphia, and she was working through it in the evenings the same way she had worked through texts at Mercer's during slow afternoons, not because she had been told to, but because the text contained information that would make her better at what she was doing, and that was sufficient reason. After a while, Callum set the leather case down and looked out at the valley. "I want to say something," he said. She looked up from the text. "When I stopped the wagon in September." He looked at his hands. "I told you that you could leave, that the debt paid didn't make you mine. I meant that. I still mean it. I know you do. What I didn't say then because I didn't know it yet, or I knew it and didn't have language for it yet, is that I hoped you would stay." He looked at her now direct with the same care he brought to everything he looked at carefully. "Not because I needed assistance. I needed assistance for 8 years and I managed without it, because of who you specifically are, because of what it's like to work alongside someone who sees things the way you see them." Nora held his gaze. The light was almost gone from the valley. "I've been thinking about how to say this since February," he continued. "I'm not fast at this kind of thing. I know that." "I know you're not fast," she said. "I didn't mind waiting." Something in him settled. Not resolved, settled the way a structure settles when weight is applied and it holds. The work here is going to keep growing. The formula being published will bring more people who know it exists. We're going to need to expand what we can do here. Yes. I want to do that with you. He paused. Not because you're here. Because you're you. It was not the language of poetry. It was the language of a man who meant exactly what he said, and nothing more and nothing less, which she had come to understand was rarer and more valuable than poetry. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know. I wanted to say it anyway, that it's a choice, that it's been a choice every day since September, and I know that, and I'm glad you keep making it." She looked at the last light on the far trees. Then she looked at him. "I came up this mountain," she said, "because there was nowhere else I could think of to go." That was true. But it stopped being the reason I stayed somewhere around the first week of October, and I have been staying for my own reasons since then. She put the medical text down on her knee. "You're one of them. The work is another. I'm not going to rank them for you because I don't think it works that way." He accepted this without argument, which was how he received things that were true. They sat on the porch until full dark came, and the stars became visible one by one above the ridgeline, the mountain stars that were different from any stars Nora had seen in Crestwood, brighter and more numerous and closer, in the way that things at altitude seem closer, as though the distance between you and the sky is shorter up here. In October, when the leaves were going and the first cold was serious again, and the patients were mostly those determined enough to make the journey before the snow closed. The road, two things arrived within a week of each other. The first was a letter from Clem Price. It was short. Her father was not a man who used language with comfort, and the shortness of the letter reflected this. He said he had been sober for 8 months, which was more months than he had managed consecutively since before Nora's mother died. He said he had found work doing carpentry repairs for the businesses on Crestwood's main road, small jobs, steady enough. He said he did not expect her to respond if she did not want to. He said he hoped she was well. At the bottom, in the cramped handwriting of a man unused to correspondence, he said he had heard about what had happened in Helena. He did not say specifically how he had heard. He said he was glad the mountain hadn't swallowed her up. He said her mother would have been glad too. Nora read it twice. Then she put it in the wooden chest in her room where she kept the things she kept. She wrote back a week later. The letter was also short. She said she was well. She said the work was hard and she was good at it. She said if he needed medical attention, she knew someone who was very good and who did not ask about payment before he asked about the problem. She said she hoped the sobriety continued. She did not say anything else. There were things that did not yet have words between them, and she was not going to perform a reconciliation that had not actually been reconciled. But the letter had been written, and it was honest, and it was more than she had offered him since September, and it was what she had to offer at this particular point. The second thing that arrived that week was a visitor. She came up the mountain on a gray horse in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, dressed for travel rather than for display, a woman perhaps 40 years old with the competent, organized bearing of someone who has been making decisions for a long time and is accustomed to having them be the right ones. She introduced herself at the door as Dr. Caroline Marsh, and the title was not a pretension because Montana Territory had in the preceding few years begun licensing women physicians under the same standards applied to men, which was more progressive than most of what surrounded it. She had read Edgar Greer's formula in the Denver Journal. She had practiced in the territory for 6 years and had come to Widow's Peak because she wanted to understand the practical application of the formula from the people who had completed it. She stayed for 4 days. In 4 days, she and Callum covered more medical territory in conversation than he had covered with another physician in 8 years, and Nora sat in on the conversations and absorbed what she could and asked questions when she had them, and took notes in the same way she took notes on everything, as though the notes were not for any specific future use, but simply because recording things accurately was a habit too valuable to be selective about. On the last evening, Dr. Marsh said something that Nora thought about for a long time afterward. They were at the table, the three of them, with a lamp between them and the mountain dark outside the windows, and Dr. Marsh had been asking about how they managed the volume of patients through the cabin with only 2 of them, and the answer to that question had ranged into a longer conversation about what it would take to do more to see more patients, to train people who could go back to their own communities with what they had learned. What you have here, Dr. Marsh said, is the beginning of something. You may not see it that way because you're inside it, and it looks like a cabin and a difficult winter and a great deal of exhausting work. She looked at both of them. But a formula published in a medical journal and a practice that has treated hundreds of patients over 8 years, and a woman who can decode deteriorated pharmaceutical notation, and a judge who ruled in your favor on the basis of evidence you gathered yourselves. She paused. That's a foundation. What you build on it is up to you. After she left, heading back down the mountain in the early morning with a copy of the patient records Nora had organized for her review, Nora stood on the porch and looked at the valley. The foundation. The road below the cabin was empty in the morning light. It would not stay empty long. It never did anymore. Callum appeared in the doorway behind her. He had coffee, 2 cups, and he handed one to her without comment, which was how most mornings began now, the small, ordinary gestures of people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that the gestures happen before the thought. New patient coming Friday, he said. Family from down near the Clark Fork. Letter came yesterday. Father logging injury hand. I'll check the carbolic acid supply. We've been going through it faster this month. We'll both check it. He came to stand beside her at the porch rail. The valley below was clear in the October morning, the river catching the low sun, the road running south toward Crestwood, which was down there somewhere behind the trees, small and specific and no longer the entire world. They stood and drank their coffee in the morning light. There was a great deal of work to do. There always was. The work did not become less because other things had been resolved. It became more because the range of what was possible had expanded, because more people knew the clinic existed, because the formula meant they had tools they had not had before, because two people doing the work were not the same as one person doing it, and two people who had learned to do it together were something different, still something more efficient and more capable and more difficult to diminish than either of them had been when they started. That was what she had been working toward, she understood now, in all the years of the pharmacy counter and the notes under the counter and the letters that came back unopened. Not to be somewhere specific, to be somewhere at all. To occupy a place in the world that was hers because she had built it, rather than because it had been assigned to her by the dimensions of her body or the limitations of a town that had run out of room for the things it could not categorize. She was somewhere now. She had built it. The coffee was hot in her hands, and the mountain air was cold on her face, and somewhere below in the cabin, the patient who had arrived the previous day was sleeping, healing on his way back toward his own life. There would be another patient Friday, and after Friday another, and the work would keep being what the work was, which was specific and difficult and sometimes not enough and sometimes more than enough, and always worth doing. "Ready," Callum said. She looked at him. At the face she had been reading for almost a year now. The face she had learned to read because it did not offer itself for reading. You had to learn it, which was a different and more reliable kind of knowledge than the kind that comes easily. "Yes," she said. They went inside. The work was waiting as it always was, as it always would be. They went to meet it together.